Balloons Over Broadway, The True Story of the Puppeteer of the Macy's Parade by Melissa Sweet, a Caldecott Honor winner. Anthony, Tony, Frederick Sarg, 1880 to 1942. Sarg rhymes with arg. Every little movement has a meaning of its own. Tony Sarg. From the time he was a little boy, Tony Sarg loved to figure out how to make things move. He once said he became a marionette man when he was only 6 years old. His father had asked him to feed their chickens at 6:30 in the morning every day. Tony had an idea. What if he could feed the chickens without leaving his bed? He rigged up some pulleys and ran rope from the chicken coop door to his bedroom window. That night, he spread chicken feed outside the chicken coop door. The next morning, Tony pulled on the rope and the door to the chicken coop opened. The chickens ate their breakfast, Tony stayed snug in his bed, and his dad, so impressed, never made Tony do another chore. When Tony grew up, he moved to London, where he discovered that no one was making marionettes for kids anymore. So out of wood, cloth, and strings, Tony began to make puppets. He figured out ways to make his marionettes' movement so lifelike that they performed as if they were real actors. Word soon spread about Tony's amazing marionettes. When Tony moved to New York City, the Tony Sarg marionettes began performing on Broadway. In the heart of New York City and Herald Square was the biggest store on earth, R.H. Macy's department store. Macy's had heard about Tony's puppets and asked him to design a puppet parade for the store's holiday windows. So Tony made new puppets based on storybook characters, then attached them to gears and pulleys to make them move. In Macy's Wondertown windows, Tony's mechanical marionettes danced across the stage as if by magic. All day long they performed to shoppers jostling for a better look. But Macy's had an even bigger job in store for Tony. Many of the people working at Macy's were immigrants, and as the holidays approached, they missed their own holiday traditions of music and dancing in the streets. Macy's agreed to put on a parade for their employees, and they hired Tony to help. Tony, too, was an immigrant, so he loved the idea of creating a parade based on street carnivals from all over the world. He made costumes and built horse-drawn floats, and Macy's even arranged to bring in bears, elephants, and camels from the Central Park Zoo. The animals joined hundreds of Macy's employees on Thanksgiving Day, 1924, winding their way from Harlem to Herald Square. It was a dazzling parade. In fact, Macy's first parade was such a success that they decided to have one every year on Thanksgiving Day to celebrate America's own holiday. Each year the parade grew, but when Macy's brought in lions and tigers, in addition to the bears, elephants, and camels, the animals roared and growled and frightened the children. Macy's asked Tony to replace the animals. "Tony, can you think of something spectacular?" "Okay." Tony hoped to replace the animals with some kind of puppets, but his marionettes were less than 3 feet tall. He would have to make much larger puppets in order for them to be seen in the parade. And how could he make them strong enough to hold up in bad weather, yet light enough to move up and down the streets? Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. When he called the company and showed them his sketches, they agreed to make what Tony wanted. Still, how would Tony make his big puppets move? Then, Tony had an idea from an Indonesian rod puppet in his toy collection. On Thanksgiving Day, Tony's creatures, some as high as 16 feet, spilled into the streets and the crowds cheered wildly. Part puppet, part balloon, the air-filled rubber bags wobbled down the avenues, propped up by wooden sticks. But now the sidewalks were so packed with people that only those in the first few rows could really see the parade. Tony realized his puppets would have to be even bigger and higher off the ground. And though the sticks helped to steer the puppets, they were stiff and heavy. Tony wanted his balloons to articulate, to move and gesture, more like puppets. But how? With the marionette, the controls are above and the puppet hangs down. But what if the controls were below and the puppet could rise up? During the next year, Tony set his new idea into motion. This time, he asked the company in Ohio to make balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber but lighter than rubber alone. Most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air, but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. Once the puppets were completed, they were deflated and shipped back to Tony in New York. Tony did not know if everything would go as planned. What if the balloons are filled with too much helium? What if one hits a sharp object? Will they fit under the L, the elevated train track? It was still dark on Thanksgiving morning when Tony filled the balloons with helium, tethering them down with sandbags. By 1 p.m., the sidewalks were packed with people ready for the parade. Then, one by one, Tony cut the lines to the sandbags. "Let's have a parade!" And the magnificent upside-down marionettes rose up to the skies. Nodding and waving to the crowds below, they sailed past Central Park. They sailed down Broadway. They shimmied and swayed through the canyons of New York City. High above the crowds, they flounced in the afternoon wind, pulling the rope handlers this way and that. Yet with every heave-ho, the balloons gestured and articulated like wild puppets, and the crowd screamed for more. After the balloons were eased under the L, they ended in front of Macy's at Tony's Wondertown windows. It was a parade New Yorkers would never forget. And from that day on, every Thanksgiving morning, crowds have lined the sidewalks of New York City to see what new balloons would rise to the skies for Macy's famous parade. Tony Sarg, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage, with a little rigging, for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. Author's note: Tony Sarg's helium-filled balloons debuted in Macy's 1928 Thanksgiving Day Parade. Balloons have risen every year since, with the exception of 2 years during World War II when rubber and helium were needed in the war effort. Tony continued to work on the parade for many years, later collaborating with Walt Disney on the character balloons. Today, more than 40 million people worldwide watch the parade, which is still imbued with the wit and humor of Tony Sarg. Tony's daughter Mary once remarked, quite simply, Tony Sarg just never grew up. When he began making puppets, he relied on his childhood love of tinkering and figuring out how things worked. He taught himself how to carve wood, build sets, sew costumes, engineer electronics, and write plays. He had a keen attention to detail and made innovations to perform puppetry, elevating it to an art form that had not been seen before. Many consider Tony Sarg to be the father of American puppetry. But Tony could not have accomplished all that he did without his talented apprentices, some of them who went on to their own fame. One of his apprentices, Bill Baird, later created the puppets for The Lonely Goat Herd, marionette show featured in the movie The Sound of Music, and one of Baird's apprentices was Jim Henson, who invented the Muppets. Even with no formal art lessons, Tony became one of the busiest artists of his day. But whether he was illustrating his children's books, designing toys, creating animations, or managing his marionette troupe as it crisscrossed the country, Tony still made time for children. They were his favorite audience. He responded to every letter he received, one of which was simply addressed Tony Sarg, New York. The caption to the photograph reads, Tony Sarg clowning around in the Goodyear hangar, and a note from his child. Dear Tony Sarg, Please send me 1 king, 2 princesses, 3 fairies, and a devil. I am sure Father will pay for them. Also, a dragon. A few words about the art. To create the art for this book, I began by making toys and puppets. I played with all sorts of materials, not knowing exactly what the outcome would be. In addition to the watercolor illustrations, my collages are, in part, a mix of paper from old books to make paper mache puppets, found objects, and fabrics, all painted or altered to illustrate what it may have felt like to be in Sarg's world. Some of the toys in my illustrations are based on ones from Tony's vast collection, but the actual toys in this book are ones I made. On a few of the pages, I even used Tony's illustrations from the Tony Sarg marionette book. I tried to keep in mind that in everything Sarg did, he conveyed the sense that he was having fun. His legacy reminds me that play may be the most important element in making art.